Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I want to talk about Dungeons & Dragons, and I want to talk about a specific type of Dungeons & Dragons participant, and that is the Dungeon Performer, colloquially known as a player, a Dungeons & Dragons player. So let's jump into this. So first of all, what we're doing here is we're talking about people who do Dungeons & Dragons and the different ways that they do Dungeons & Dragons, the ways that they participate in Dungeons & Dragons, and I wanted to thank you. I'm excited about this series, and this is a series of discussions about different types of Dungeons & Dragons participants. And I'm very excited about this because I think it's really going to help us understand Dungeons & Dragons better. And I don't think we don't do this often. We don't think about how many ways different people participate in Dungeons & Dragons and how they participate. Let's talk about the Dungeon Performer. So first of all, Dungeon Performer is my term, and I'm trying to get it going. Dungeon Master is such an incredible title. It's such an amazing crown. Player is nothing. Player means nothing, right? It is such a horrible word to describe what Dungeons and Dragons performers do. So why do I call them Dungeons & Dragons performers? I'm sorry, Dungeon Performers. Dungeon Master, Dungeon Performer. Why do I call them Dungeon Performer? First of all, I think acting is a huge part of what they do. They act, right? They take on the role of an identity that they have made a social contract with. They sit down, they take the Dungeons & Dragons character sheet, okay, in its most base form, right? It's a piece of paper that looks like a tax form, and they ink it, right? And the moment they do that, the Dungeon Performer is simultaneously making a social contract with every single other Dungeon Performer at the table, with the Dungeon Master, with that character. They are making a social contract to bring that character to life and to run that character till the wheels fall off, right? To bring that character to a satisfying end for the character, for the party, for the dungeon master, for themselves, and for the character's own sake. And this character and there is this question among the best dungeon performers: what is my relationship to this character, and have I done them justice at the table, right? Huge material. And they do that with the power of acting. Acting, right? They are acting, and this is very special. Dungeon Performer, they are performing an identity, they are performing a role, right? And honestly, it surpasses what the greatest actors have done when they've left film and went back to stage as an established premier actor, and it is them interacting with content that is more important and more valuable than what Shakespeare did. So like Patrick Stewart, right, has done Shakespeare on Broadway, right? And what I'm saying is that Dungeon Performers surpass that, right? The social contract they create is broader. And acting, and what Gary Gygax did with the Dungeon Performer, with creating the Dungeon Performer, is so huge because basically, yes, Patrick Stewart got to do Shakespeare on Broadway. He was able to leverage his power as a megastar from Star Trek. Ignore the fact that he's a British actor, and Americans shouldn't care about a British actor, but we do if their talent is high enough, right? And he was able to leverage that to go on stage as a Shakespearean actor. And what Dungeon Performers are doing is larger than that, right? And one of the reasons why is Gary was like, hey, I see the power of acting. I understand how important it is for a housewife to play, in the Virginia Woolf play, to play in a local community theater of Virginia Woolf's material, right? And how this allows her to transform, how this allows her to escape expectations of her gender, expectations of her class, expectations of her occupation, which many people don't even see as an occupation, but in this moment she can be seen, right? And and he gave it to everyone, and with no limitations on, you're going to study for 2 months and then you're going to do 3 you're going to do, 3 shows and then it's back to your normal life. He said, hey, I want to remove wealth restrictions from acting, and I want to allow anyone and everyone to act and not be limited in the sets, right? Be able to go from world to world to world to world to world and have this identity and put it on as a narrative, as a powerful personal narrative, not something disgusting like what Shakespeare did, just some slop that's put out for a king, queen, and 20 million subjects. What happens at the Dungeons and Dragons table is the most valuable narratives in the world because it's hyper personal, right? It's what's happening in Faerun, and it's what's happening in your heart, in context to the hearts of your friends or people who are not your friends, who you are sharing your personal emotions, your personal intellect, your personal wisdom with. And the Dungeon Performer is so powerful, and yet, let's get there. The Dungeon Performer hasn't even arrived yet. It really hasn't even arrived yet. The Dungeon Performer, the player of Dungeons and Dragons, is fully cocooned. We haven't even come close to seeing the final form of a Dungeons and Dragons player, of a Dungeon Performer. Now, what do I mean by this? I want please listen carefully here. The Dungeon Master has arrived, right? But there are actually extremely few Dungeon Performers, right? You're like, wait a second, Scott, there's lots of Dungeons and Dragons players. No, that's not correct. There's a ton of Dungeon Masters who are sitting in the dungeon, in the Dungeon Performer seat. It's not the same thing. Dungeon Masters playing Dungeons and Dragons, that's not a Dungeons and Dragons player. The Dungeons and Dragons player has not even arrived yet. You know how you can tell this? Look at me, right? I'm a Dungeon Master commentating on D&D. There are 1,000 of me. There are 1,000 of me. There are 1,000 of me. Most are worse, but few are better. But it's, where is the Dungeons and Dragons player commentator? A person who has dedicated their life to Dungeons and Dragons play, to being a Dungeon Performer, and commentating on that and helping others do it. It does not exist. It does not exist. And the reason why is we've never had someone who was interested in Dungeons and Dragons and wanted to master play and not be a Dungeon Master. So the Dungeon Performer participant is literally cocooned, right? And this is why I'm so astounded by what Gary created. Gary Gygax created this world in which what he set into motion in 1974. I'm so excited because I've talked about this for 5 solid years. What is Dungeons and Dragons? And I'm telling you, at the beginning of 2024, you have no idea how much human potential, how much catalyst is built into Dungeons and Dragons. And just like Oppenheimer exploded, exploded the atom and gave us the atom bomb, right? And actually, that's what Gary Gygax truly is. He is the anti-Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer split the atom and spread destruction. I think Gary Gygax split human emotion, human wisdom, and human intellect at the basest level and exploded our potential. That's what Dungeons and Dragons really is. And that's what the Dungeon Performer is dealing with. Every single word you just heard is my humble opinion. What's important is when I get to hear your humble opinion, when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.